All right, Econ friends, welcome back for our next video. In this one, we're going to be moving our discussion from GDP to our second big economic data metric, our second big data point, our second big calculation, and that is inflation. Really important, major topic in macroeconomics, something that policymakers tend to fear. We're going to be focusing in this video on some of the mechanics of how inflation is measured and tracked and calculated, because we need those data points, again, to make good economic policies down the line and to really understand the overall health and the direction of an economy. So with that said, let's jump into our second metric, inflation. When we talk about inflation, we're going to define that as an increase in the overall price level in the economy. Now, this is really, really important. Most people understand that inflation refers to an increase in prices. But what's really important is to remember that at any given time within an economy, within the individual markets within an economy, prices are always fluctuating. At any given time, the prices of some items are rising, the prices of other items are falling, some prices are staying constant, and then you add to that that some new products are being introduced into the economy and other products are becoming obsolete and are kind of just evaporating and no longer around. So we see this flux in prices all the time, with some prices rising while simultaneously others fall and others stay flat. When we're talking about inflation, we're talking about a macro measurement. So we are not concerned with individual prices of individual goods in individual markets. Instead, our focus is on the overall price level. The overall, AKA the average price that exists within an economy. So when we talk about inflation, the formal definition, it's an increase in the overall price level in the economy. And we'll discuss shortly how we get there. But it's really important to know and to bear in mind that just because one or two prices that you see are going up, the prices of housing in California are going up, or the price of gasoline is going up, that by itself does not constitute inflation, because inflation is a macro measurement that's looking at the overall price level. With that said, we do know that inflation will lead to a decline in the value of money, as at its core, higher overall prices are going to reduce the purchasing power of your dollars. So inflation is really important to economists. Lots of reasons why. Among the primary ones, inflation at its core, this overall rise in economic prices, a rise in the overall average price level, it's going to fundamentally hurt your purchasing power. It will mean that the dollars that you hold are going to decline in value, okay? When we talk about inflation, we measure it via the inflation rate. The inflation rate is defined as the annual percentage change in the overall price level in the economy. As I mentioned before, at any given time, prices are going to vary widely. But we're looking at the overall average price level, and specifically the inflation rate is a change rate. A little side note here. Whenever you're talking about in economics a rate change, a rate change is almost always going to be measured as a percentage change. The general rule on how you calculate this, it's the old rule. Sorry about that. New minus old divided by old. If you have two data points, two series of data, whether it's prices or salaries or any other variable, you take the old one and then the new one. The rate change is going to be the new value minus the old value, that's up here, divided by the old value. That will give you the rate change, okay? And we're going to do that a little bit, do some practice questions in class. Know for now that inflation does have multiple adverse effects on the economy. We'll discuss these in more detail later. But as a brief overview, know that inflation is considered really, really serious by economists. Number one, high and variable inflation. It's going to reduce investment. Well, we learned earlier that investment is I, which is a big part of our GDP. We said that GDP, remember, was C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Well, if we have this high and variable inflation, we're going to see I fall. Investment will fall because companies just can't do long-term planning. And if I falls, then by definition, overall GDP is going to fall. And that's not a good thing. Okay. Number two, we learned way back in our opening section that prices send signals. Inflation distorts those signals. So it's very hard for both buyers and sellers, for households and firms, to make really good economic decisions because the price signals are a little bit flawed and distorted when you have a lot of inflation. Number three, high and variable inflation will result in less productive use of resources. Number four, unexpected inflation often serves to redistribute wealth and income, which can tie into some aspects of economic equity, issues of economic fairness, and maybe if you're inclined to think about these things, economic ethics. Number five, inflation reduces consumer purchasing power. Number six, inflation, and this is a really big one, inflation harms lenders as well as people, like many of those who are retired, who are on fixed incomes. Okay, this is a really important one, especially from the social lens. If you think about inflation as an increase in the overall price level, it's going to really, really hurt lenders. If a lender makes a loan to you, okay, so inflation helps borrowers, but inflation hurts lenders. If I loan you money and I say, I need you to pay me back $100 a month for the next 5 years, and then right after I make that loan, there's massive inflation, the $100 that you pay me back every month is not going to have a whole lot of value down the line. So I'm hurt by that. Now, that would mean that maybe I'll charge you an artificially high rate, or I'm not going to make the loan, but you can see that inflation is going to really hurt lenders. And very sadly, inflation can also hurt people on fixed incomes, specifically retired people. Think about this. You retire, you're going to get a pension. Your pension says that they're going to give you $1,000 a month until you die. Well, if prices stay stable, that pension's great. But imagine that immediately after you retire and you start getting that pension, that fixed amount of $1,000 a month, we have massive inflation. Well, inflation lowers your buying power. And all of a sudden, that fixed income is not going to be sufficient to sustain you, and your chances of entering poverty are going to increase. So these are some pretty nasty effects. So inflation overall is bad. And we always look at it in macroeconomics. We're always on the lookout for when it's coming, and we're always on the lookout to keep prices stable. And if we see inflation, we're immediately thinking about what are some of the policy steps that we can take to mitigate this problem. I do want to point out, because we've said that inflation is bad, the opposite of inflation is deflation. That's a decrease in the overall price level. A lot of people, when they first read on and study inflation, they would say, well, if inflation's really bad, maybe deflation's okay because prices are falling. In fact, in economics, we think that deflation is very harmful to an economy. In fact, most economists believe that deflation is actually more harmful than inflation. It's a different problem entirely, but again, it's got some serious issues. But I bring this up so that if you ever hear about deflation, you don't think that it's a benign force, that it's no big thing, because deflation is equally troubling. In fact, to some economists, more troubling. For all these reasons, we'll conclude this little subsection by saying that one of the key goals of macro economic policy, one of the key goals of economic policy makers is to maintain stable prices over time. If inflation is bad and deflation is bad, then that nice middle road of price stability, stable, predictable prices, is a major economic goal at the macro level. Now let's jump into the idea of, we know what inflation is, how do we measure it? Okay, it's a pretty simple thing. So let me take you through the steps. We'll do some practice questions when we're live time on Zoom and lecture later on, okay? But at its core, economists gauge the price level and they measure the inflation rate through the use of a price index. Okay, really critical idea here. Okay, so economists will gauge the price level and they will measure the inflation rate by creating and using a price index. A price index measures the average prices, and here's the critical part about how you build it and how you construct it and how you interpret it. The average prices of a fixed basket of goods and services. So basically, economists will just create this basket of goods and services. The components of the basket are arbitrary. It doesn't really matter, although there's different baskets for different types of measurements. But the key is, once you make the basket, you keep the contents of the basket fixed, steady, constant. And once you have this fixed basket, and if you keep the contents constant in it, then you can measure inflation by simply pricing that basket year by year by year. So again, we use a price index, this fixed basket of goods and services, to both measure the inflation rate and understand our prices. The basket is determined and priced in what we call a base year. Okay, the idea of base year is going to be very critical coming up. The base year is like the peg year. It's the baseline year. It's the year that we use as our grounding starting point, and everything else is measured against that year. Okay, so the basket that we're talking about will be determined and priced in a base year, and it will stay fixed in terms of its composition in years ahead. As such, it's going to serve as a baseline for price comparisons across future years. I mean, simply imagine that you take a basket of goods and you price it today, and then you price that same basket in a year, and price that same basket in another year and another year. If you keep your basket ingredients constant by taking prices year to year to year to year, you can track the overall price level. You can gauge the inflation rate, and then you'll know what we're dealing with at that macroeconomic level. So again, price indexes, really, really important. There are many different types of price indexes. So I want to point out that the price index is critical. It's the key to understanding how inflation is gauged and measured and tracked. But there are many different types of price indexes that do different things. Some of the most common ones that you might hear of are known as the Consumer Price Index. That's the CPI. That's a widely reported one. The Consumer Price Index is just that. It's a price index for lots of the things that consumers, you and I, consume. There's also what's known as the Producer Price Index, which is a price index that would tie to what producers buy, things like raw materials, fuel and energy prices, labor prices, things like that. There's an index known as the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index. And there's a real common one at the macro policy level known as the GDP deflator. Okay, you don't need to know these in major depth, just know that all of these, the CPI, the PPI, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, and the GDP deflator, they all are some form of a price index. And as such, their role, their job is to help us track prices and gauge inflation rates over time, okay? Just so you know, just for your knowledge, this, which is one of the ones that's used at the national level, the Consumer Price Index. This is what it's composed of. You can just see in this pie chart that the CPI is a market basket. It's composed of things that consumers, hence the C part of CPI, that consumers purchase. And you can see that this basket has components including education, communication, recreation, medical and healthcare, transport, housing, almost always the biggest one because housing is really expensive, food and beverages, and other. So what you have is a market basket that contains all the different things that the typical consumer, that the typical citizen needs to have a life. You know, housing and food and transport and leisure and health, and you get the idea. And then what happens is every month, the government, specifically the BLS, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, they go out to markets all over the country, and they simply look up and get prices on all of the components that are in this index. They multiply the number of products times the price, they add it together, and now you have a price index. This happens every month, every quarter, every year at lots and lots of different geographical locations across the country. That allows America's BLS, again, our Bureau of Labor and Stats, to not just determine the overall national inflation rate, but also to determine inflation rates at local levels. So sometimes you'll see that, the inflation rate within a particular district or state or city, what they call a metropolitan area, is rising rapidly. You say, how do they know this? Well, they know it because the BLS will take this market basket and take sample prices at frequent intervals at local levels. When you add it all up, you get the local inflation rate. And when you add it all up at the national level, you get the national inflation rate. Once you have the market basket, and then once you've tracked prices of that basket over time, you can calculate the price index. And the price index is a simple formula. As we said before, all of our percentage rate changes are going to be new minus old divided by old formulas. So when it comes to a price index, the price index is simply the cost of the market basket in the current year divided by the cost of the market basket in the base year times 100. This is a variation of this formula here. So again, you get your basket, you price it in your base year and in all your future years. If you divide your market basket price in the current year by your market basket price in the base year and multiply it by 100, you have your price index. Once you have your price index, then it's a very simple step to calculate your inflation rate. Your inflation rate will be the change in the price index from the prior year divided by the price index in the prior year times 100. But again, if you think about it, the change in a price index from the prior year, that's the new minus old. If you want to see the inflation rate in 2020 compared to 2012, you take your price index in 2012, that's your base year, that's your old year. You take your current price index in 2020, that's your new year, and your change in the price index will be new minus old. Your prior year is going to be your old. You multiply it by 100%, and that, my friends, is your formula for the inflation rate. So there's a lot going on here, but at its core, I need you to walk away with knowing what inflation is, why it's considered a major macroeconomic issue, and how it has these negative effects. But critically, I need you to understand how we track inflation. The inflation rate refers to the change in the value of a price index over time. A price index, in turn, represents a fixed basket of goods that we price over time. Put that all together, and it's complicated, but at the end of the day, it's fairly a straightforward task to determine, gauge, and track inflation. Okay? And with that said, our inflation discussion is done. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you next video.